The Muslim world always seems to get away with things that would otherwise send shockwaves around the world. Consider, on May 29, reports emerged that the Egyptian state was preparing to close down and seize the oldest continuously running Christian monastery in the world. I speak of the Greek Orthodox monastery of St. Catherine, which was built on Mount Sinai by Emperor Justinian I around 550 AD, making it almost 1500 years old. According to a report from Church Times, the Egyptian court ruling could result in the confiscation of the property and the eviction of its monks. Purported plans included transforming certain areas into a museum. This is a wild move, even for a Muslim nation, as Adel Gindi, an Egyptian historian and co-founder of the human rights group Coptic Solidarity, writes, quote, "According to the law of Egypt, if someone occupies a desert plot and cultivates and develops it for a certain period, 15 years, they are legally entitled to own it, and thus have the right to sell it, pass it on, etc. The state cannot simply come years later and tell them on a whim that they were merely beneficiaries of the land and then seize it or force them to pay a ransom. So what about this monastery, which has been continuously inhabited, developed, and cultivated for more than 1,450 years? What indeed? The monastery, to put this in perspective, is older than Islam itself. Christian monks have been living in it since before Muhammad was born. As such, St. Catherine's is not just some monastery or church that Muslim Egypt is appropriating for its own uses, as it has done to thousands of churches over the centuries. It is a UNESCO-protected site, which by definition means that the UN recognizes it for having outstanding universal value to humanity. It is therefore protected under international conventions to ensure its preservation for future generations. These are all quotes and language from the UNESCO website. In other words, the world, mankind in general, owns St. Catherine's, not the modern nation state that the monastery happens to find itself in due to the vicissitudes of history, namely the Muslim conquest of Egypt. In a May 29 statement, Hieronymus, the Archbishop of Athens and all Greece, condemned the, quote, scandalous decision involving the violent violation of human and specifically religious freedoms by the Egyptian judicial system, adding that, quote, the Egyptian government has effectively chosen to dismantle every notion of justice and, with a single stroke, attempt to erase the very existence of the monastery, abolishing its religious, spiritual, and cultural function. The monastery's property is being seized and expropriated. After calling on the international community to act, the Archbishop closed by writing, quote, I do not want to believe, I cannot believe, that today Hellenism and Orthodoxy are experiencing yet another historical fall. Yet another historical fall? Today? While many failed to understand this reference, he was clearly alluding to the fact that May 29, when news of this court ruling surfaced, and when the Archbishop issued his statement, is the very same date that Muslims conquered another ancient Greek Orthodox church, also built by Justinian I, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, another UNESCO heritage site that was only recently violated by its Muslim overseers. In 2022, the Turkish government transformed it into yet another mosque, even though Istanbul has already over 3,000 mosques. In other words, the Archbishop's warning that the Egyptian court ruling aims to, quote, erase the very existence of the monastery, abolishing its religious, spiritual, and cultural function, is precisely what Islam has always done and continues to do, despite trying to be and trying to enjoy the benefits of being a standing member of the world community, as with Turkey, which really wants to be a member of the European Union. Indeed, to show you the sheer hypocrisy, if not stupidity, of Egypt, this latest court ruling blatantly disregarding UNESCO resolutions comes at the very same time that Egypt is fervently campaigning for an Egyptian candidate to be the next Director General of UNESCO. Look it up, his name is Khaled El-Inani. Alright, let's take a step back. To underscore what Muslim nations like Egypt and Turkey are doing, that is, spitting in the eye of the world, especially its Christians, it's always best to consider how this would look if the shoe were on the other foot, if the West did something like this to Islam. Of course, one cannot come up with any examples of Christians seizing mosques on land that was always Muslim. It's quite the opposite. Almost all of the land that now constitutes the so-called Muslim world was taken by conquest and bloodshed, jihad, and mostly from Christians, all throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia Minor, but also from Persians, Hindus, and peoples further east. Even during the Crusades and the Reconquista in Spain, when Christians transformed a few mosques into churches, they did so knowing full well that such mosques were once churches. A notable example occurred during the Seventh Crusade, after King Louis IX put the Muslims of Egypt to flight following the June 6th Battle of Damietta in 1249. That city's massive mosque, once a church, was reconsecrated as a church, and Louis gave thanks to God for his victory in it. In the words of Louis's mother, Blanche, quote, "The site of the mosque, which some time ago, when the city was previously captured," she means by Muslims in the 7th century, "was the church of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was reconciled, and thanks were given there to God Most High." Nor were the Crusaders, unlike their modern descendants, oblivious to the fact that all of the Near East and North Africa, and not just Jerusalem, were originally part of Christendom. Thus, Louis's foundation charter for the reconsecration of this same church turned mosque turned church again, dated November 1249, says things like, quote, "After this country, Egypt, is liberated from the hands of the infidels," and, quote, "when this land is liberated." At any rate, the point here is that one cannot find identical examples of Christians doing to Muslims what Muslims have done and continue to do. That is, seize the pre-existing buildings and sites of other religions. And the reason for that is because Islam is some 600 years newer than Christianity. And as such, it is the one that seized Christian buildings, sites, and entire nations, not vice versa. The same incidentally goes for Islam vis-a-vis all other civilizations and religions. Because Islam was the new kid on the block, so too was it the one that conquered and appropriated the sites and temples of other religions, Jews, Persians, Hindus, Buddhists, et al. Not the other way around. As for those very few Muslim buildings that were built under Muslim rule, but have reverted to Christian rule, such as in Spain, which Muslims invaded in the 8th century, destroying or transforming churches into mosques, as usual, these are treated with immense care by Western authorities. Take the Alhambra, which Muslims built in Granada in the 14th century. Although it's only about 780 years old, that is half as old as St. Catherine's Monastery, and although it was built on what was then conquered Christian land, it is one of the most thoroughly managed UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Europe. And Spain spends tens of millions every single year on it, euros, 28 million euros in just 2022, to preserve and maintain it. In other words, to underscore what Egypt is doing, we have to resort to our imaginations. Imagine for a moment that there was an ancient Native American temple in North America, one that preceded European settlement by centuries, one that is, of course, a UNESCO site, and one that thousands of modern-day Native Americans pilgrimage to annually. And now imagine the American government announcing that it is going to seize it and kick out its indigenous inhabitants and turn it into one more American church. How do you think the world media, the loudmouth left, and international wokery would react? No such reaction was, of course, evident concerning Egypt's recent ruling against St. Catherine. That said, Greece did get very vocal, enough to embarrass Egypt and cause its president, Sisi, to issue a statement announcing his, quote, full commitment to preserving the unique and sacred religious status of St. Catherine's Monastery and preventing its violation. That sounds good, but the very next sentence states that, quote, the presidency of Egypt affirms that the recent court ruling consolidates this status. In other words, Sisi is not reversing the court ruling. Rather, that initial court ruling is, according to him, dedicated to preserving the unique and sacred religious status of St. Catherine's Monastery. Huh? If that was the case, why did the recent court ruling provoke such a fierce response from Greece and its hierarchs? Sisi probably just doesn't want to admit to any wrongdoing. It's all a misunderstanding, he's trying to imply. The law itself is fine, the ruling is fine, the Greeks just failed to understand it. In reality, Egypt has been bullying and threatening St. Catherine's for years. In fact, back in 2018, I wrote an article on how Egyptian authorities shut down the monastery right before and apparently to prevent Christmas worship services. Link in the description. And that's just the government. Arab marauders, Bedouins, and terrorists of every stripe have been known to target the ancient Christian site, situated as it is in the Sinai Peninsula. As Adel Gindi, author of A Sword Over the Nile, a book that traces the plight of Egypt's indigenous Christians under Islamic rule from the 7th century to the present, writes, quote, this historic monastery, St. Catherine, and its monks have suffered greatly through the ages. Yet it has never faced such an existential threat, not under the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ayyubids, the Fatimids, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, the Muhammad Ali dynasty, or even the post-1952 July officers regime, all the way through to 2012. Isn't it astonishing that the current Neo-Ikhwan, he means Neo-Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood, Egyptian regime is now engaging in such deeply concerning actions? Indeed, it's also a reminder that peaceful and subtle Islamic machinations, which the West has a complete blind spot for, are sometimes more dangerous and decisive than run-of-the-mill Muslim violence.